Okay, so I'll just make sure everyone has the doc up. So the agenda is in this Google Doc. So the first thing I just wanted to make sure is on the recording is if anyone wants to add things to the future agenda, even if you can't be at the meeting, but preferably if you can, use either the section at the top called future agenda items of the doc, which I just posted, or demos. So if you've got cool features of Kubeflow components you're building or you've finished and you want to show the community, feel free to kind of organize a demo. We'll try and keep them to 15 minutes sort of times so that we don't waste all the time. But it'd be awesome if we could have lots of people contributing issues they think are really important to highlight to the whole community, or kind of issues which span across the sort of components and working groups would be good. Anyway, that's just wanted to housekeeping, put that in there. So there was a meeting last week in this time slot, and Josh, I think you were running it, or was someone else running it, about planning session or talking with end users. Do you have a recap for that, or?
Yeah, we did have all the working group or subject matter leads present what was going on in their particular project, and they posted the top questions that they wanted in the feature request channel in Slack. And we've continued to try to drive people in there. I haven't seen much interaction. I've seen a couple people post things after, but I thought that the talk went pretty well. People did a lot of good upgrade. The only one we did not get to was pipelines. And at some point we do need to do a review of the pipelines projects as well. So I think Yuan is on, but at some point we should probably touch on that as well.
So you're saying we should organize a future meeting, or just with the users again, or just reviewing it?
I think that we should invite the users, or just it's up to you on how he wants to get feedback. But I do think that we should make an effort to have end users continue to bring in new input. And I think that pipelines is one of the most important components. And the more feedback we can get in, probably the better.
Cool.
I think there, for pipelines, I think there's no big feature like we are going to release in Kubeflow 1.2. So we are not blocking on that. But I think it would be great if we can keep asking users to come offline to the feature request channel and answer questions.
Maybe we could add that to the top of every one of these community meetings so that people, if they watch the recordings, they can, even if the first few seconds, they can tell that that's a channel that exists. Maybe, I don't know.
Sounds good.
Just an idea. I'll put that at the top of this one. Feature request channel. Okay. Slack channel to be precise. Okay, cool. So there was someone just quickly added a note about migrating to AWS for testing infrastructure. I forget who exactly was in charge of that. So do you have, who wants to talk about that?
All right. I think, yeah, this is Jiaxin from AWS, and he also from AWS also here. So we draft a doc to talk about the the solutions to run Kubeflow end-to-end test on AWS. Excuse me. Yeah, it includes the testing infra part and the test case part. So I think most of the work actually has been done by the GCP team in the past. So the doc just talk about the alternatives to use AWS resources to build the similar solutions. I think a lot of things are covered, like the high-level infrastructure and whether we want to use pro or internal pro, sorry, the pro from SIG testing or from like self-host Pro. I think, yeah, and I also talk about like the security and shared permissions, like how to add more people to maintain the clusters. Jeremy has the few issues created under Kubeflow testing, and that's all P1 issues. And I think we'd like to resolve those issues and unblock the working groups like development as soon as possible for the long term. And yeah, we'd like to get some feedbacks here, and for anything not clear or not covered in the doc, we'd like to get some feedbacks and address them.
Okay, cool. So I don't know if this chatting is the best time for everyone to just have their comments, but I guess the thing is that everyone should where should they have their feedback for your proposal?
Right.
Where should they put it? Sorry.
Just on the doc.
Okay, cool. So I've linked that in the chat, and it's also in the doc in the Google Doc. Animesh, you're unmuted. Do you want to say something?
Yeah, I did. I mean, just a question for you, Jackson. How much of a buy-in in general does it have with your team in AWS? And part of the question is because, you know, I mean, just in case, and we have encountered this situation many a times, right, where an individual moves, right, the problem happens when, you know, the individual was a primary sponsor for something, right? So just wanted to get a sense of that from your side, because, you know, I mean, this, if the teams or the different projects all migrate to this, right, do you have a little bit more solid, you know, uptake within your team, and this is going to stick for a longer term?
Yeah, so that's I think a question or issue we discussed a lot internally. I think on our side, Kubeflow is a long-term strategy, like under the ML section for Kubernetes team. And currently, we like to put like one full-time engineers on the support. And like I think for testing related issues, we will set some SLAs later. Probably we don't have a like a detailed number yet, but assume like 24 hours. Any issues will be on the AWS side will be resolved in 24 hours. And so the engineer effort will keep working on the like the testing infra to improve the like the extensibility or flexibilities, and yeah, gradually hit the like the goal to share the common infra. I think that's currently that's our like I think internal discussion result. And on the credit side, I think internally this has been proved. We're going through the process to apply the credits for the open source account to set up everything. But this won't be a block users because at the same time we will use the internal account for testing for POC, and it will be switch over later once the new account is set up. I think we treat this similar as other Kubernetes or Kubernetes SIG projects like CSI or cloud providers, etc. So the overall strategy is like that. Yeah.
Cool. Just reiterating, anyone who wants to have comments on that, I guess probably we as a community will need to vote on what's exactly happening, or maybe the working group leads will have to vote on their own independent migrations to it.
Right. Yeah, one thing I want to mention is currently I think we don't have plan to for them to for example create a like working group testing, etc. But this is we need more feedbacks on this, and it just provides an alternative platform to run the test. It totally depends on the working group owners to choose to use it or not. Yeah, so that's our opinion. Yep.
Cool. Unless anyone has any burning comments they need to make out loud on that, we'll move on to the next one because we've got.
Yeah, so I think Jackson, this is Jeremy. Thank you so much for doing this. I think this is huge. I think I think you've seen my comments in the doc. I think the only thing we have to figure out is make sure we have a scalable way for people to configure their repositories, or the working groups to configure their tests to send the appropriate hooks to the appropriate test infra. And I think once we figure out a scalable way to do that, so that people can easily opt into using the AWS infra or using their alternative infra, I think we'll have a good and scalable solution.
Yeah,
cool.
That's good.
Sorry, I cut you off, Jackson.
No, I mean, sounds good. Yeah.
Cool. Okay, so there's a bunch of working group proposals that haven't been merged still, which is the notebook and the deployment one. Let's just start with the notebook one. I'll post that proposal in the chat. We won't cover these too much, just because they should hopefully be ready. Notebook. Okay, so I think Jeremy had the most comments on the notebook one. There was some discussion around whether multiple IDEs should be in the scope of the working group for notebooks. Jeremy, do you want to say your points there, or?
Yeah, so I think my point on the PR was that I think as a whole we're trying to keep scope pretty narrow to start with, because the main goal with one of the key problems that we're trying to solve with the working groups is to create accountability for all the different aspects for in Kubeflow. So I think we want to make sure that we're having accountability and deliverables for the notebook related artifacts, and make sure that we establish a track record there before expanding the scope. So that's the motivation for having narrow scope.
Was someone else unmuted? Constant?
So this is Konstantinos. Kimonos is on European time zone, so he couldn't join. But from our side, Jeremy, I think we're fine with this, and start with this and then expand to the other IDs. Kimonos will also be commenting on the PR, so we can merge.
Sounds great. I think that was the only issue or concern I had. So I think once that's addressed, we can go ahead and get that merged.
So I just have one question about that specifically, is so if we do expect, because there's a lot of issues about adding other IDEs, so who's going to own those?
I would say at this point that development should happen outside Kubeflow. That would be my initial proposal.
What do you mean by that, by the way? Like, they're just kind of like containers, really, and making sure that we don't break the controller for notebooks, I guess, right?
I think whoever wants to develop that, so like, if it's Ericto or in Kimonos, they can start putting it up in the Ericto repo and they can start developing it there, and whoever wants to collaborate there can do it. Or you could go and create a repo in GitHub and invite Kimonos and everybody else to collaborate there. But I think as a general, my current thinking, and people can disagree with me, I think we should focus right now on fit and finish and sort of keeping the scope of Kubeflow constant until we sort of are really humming along, and not sort of take on more work. So I think people are welcome to go and do other development and start other projects. I just think that should sort of happen outside Kubeflow at this point.
Would you be comfortable with the working group for that if they're willing to, for notebooks being willing to expand their scope or something? Because I think there is some plans to do some quite significant refactoring of the notebook and other parts of the project already.
I'm sorry, I don't understand the question.
Like, I'm just wondering, like, because who's actually, like, so if someone wants to, this is just more of a general question, I guess. If someone wants to add a feature to Kubeflow, who gets to say that they can or can't?
So I think it's all sort of projects have owners, and so if you're adding to a project, you should be talking to the project owners, and that's the working group owners, right? So I think I don't. So I guess if you're asking, like, what happens if you want to expand the scope of if you want to start taking the code base that you already have for notebooks and adding features that to start doing Taya and RStudio, I don't think that anybody's going to object, like try to stop you or get in your way. You know, we're going to sort of give the flexibility and freedom to the work group owners and the project owners. But I think what would happen is, you know, when we sort of evaluate the performance of the working group, we're going to evaluate it with respect to the expectation set with respect to the charter. So, you know, if we don't deliver a good notebook experience, and the reason that that's given for the notebook experience is that the work group was off, you know, developing other features, I think, you know, people would look at that working group as not sort of meeting the expectations that were set and agreed upon with respect to the rest of the community as set in the charter. Does that make sense? Does that seem fair?
I mean, it makes sense. I just think it's going to become a problem not just for notebooks though, because like everyone's going to be adding features constantly, right? So this is kind of a very general problem that we're going to run into.
And I don't think we're trying to prevent people from adding features. I think the goal is to establish clear expectations and accountability with respect to what the priorities of the community are expecting from that working group, and making sure that the working group is delivering on those priorities and not sort of, you know, developing other features at the expense of those meeting those expectations. As long as they're meeting those expectations, I don't think anybody's going to complain.
Then in this particular case, is it acceptable for I mean, obviously that's not a feature of Kubeflow right now, so maybe it doesn't make sense for it to be in the charter, and I see what you're saying there. But I'm just wondering if that working group people, if those working group people are willing to take on that responsibility, I assume you'd be all right with that.
So yeah, I mean, I'm not in the business of trying to tell people what to do. It's not my, you know, like I don't, you know, you're not a Google employee. You don't report to me. I can't tell you what to do or how to spend your time. So you and Kimonis are free to collaborate on whatever projects you guys want to collaborate on. I think the question is, you know, again, when we evaluate the working group and we're evaluating it, you know, how well it's doing, we're going to evaluate it with respect to the expectations and scope set out in the charter. So whatever else you do in addition to that is fantastic, but I think the main sort of requirement is that it's going to be how well are you performing with respect to the expectations set by the charter.
You keep talking about this. I mean, I don't want to hop on about this because we obviously have other agenda items, but I'm just wondering what do you mean by evaluate? Just can you be precise?
So I think what we're going to, you know, like if you look at the charters, right, the goal of the charters is to the charters lay out very specific expectations. You know, they say like, okay, the charter, the working groups have to deliver updates every so often. And if the working group doesn't deliver on those expectations, then the working group gets shut down. So that's what I mean by evaluate. So, you know, I think as we mature, we will increase and ramp up the expectations for working groups. And, you know, if working groups are not, you know, delivering and we're not sort of capable of delivering quality products, then, you know, we have no choice but to sort of shut them down.
I think what you're trying to say is that's more about semantics of what a working group is, right? If the working group is called Apple working groups, it's working on apples and it's supposed to deliver products around eating apples. And so, you know, if working groups decides to embark on other things and they don't do apples anymore, then it's just not the intent of the working group. That's probably what you're trying to say, right? Is that it's always specific. It's always a conversation that needs to be specific to each subject. You know, does I don't know, hyperparameter tuning belong in the notebooks working group? Probably not, right? So that's I think that it's pretty simple about just defining the semantics of a working group, the charter of it, and the name of it.
Well, maybe the working group needs to be renamed to IDE.
That's what I was thinking, actually, to be honest, because it's clear. I think is a pretty clear desire from the community to have those features. So I think there needs to be owners for them. Like that's kind of.
So I think so. My objection there is like one of the first things that we're trying to do with the working groups is create clear ownership and accountability for the things that we've already as a community have committed to. So the things that we are already committed to as a community are notebooks, and we're sort of struggling. And I think your issues that you've highlighted and pointed out to deliver on a really good notebook experience. So the point of keeping the scope narrow is to set very clear expectations. Like the focus that we want for this working group is to be focused on delivering these notebook assets, because that's what we're committed to and that's what we're struggling to do. And I think, if we do that really well, then we're fine expanding the scope of the working group to include other IDEs. But I think the expectation at this point should be to focus on notebooks.
Right, it makes sense. And there is so much actually desired scope there. Integration of notebooks with Git and better scheduling of notebooks and a lot of stuff, right? So it's just a very large scope already. And for a lot of users, it's the primary way how they see Kubeflow, the end users. They see it through their notebook experience.
Yep. Sounds good. Okay, so I guess anyone else who wants to comment on that should comment on the pull request that's listed in the doc. Other than that, there's a deployment working group pull request currently there as well, which I don't have any knowledge really of, but is someone wanting to talk about that, why that's not merged yet? Or?
Yeah, I think Jeremy left a couple of comments about the generic configs and the scope of those configs.
You're quite quiet, by the way.
Sorry about that. Yeah, so I think Jeremy left a couple of comments on the generic Kubernetes configs that we have, the kfkettle k8s and the kfkettle dex configs, and the scope of those configs, and whether the deployment working group should own them. That is still unaddressed. So I think once that is addressed, we'll be ready to merge that.
I think this also relates back to a future agenda item, which is around the issue about just kind of, there was a lot of discussion that I may have created about the manifest repo and just kind of its current state being quite messy. I don't think that's I think it's such a wide scope that we can probably just highlight it to people here. But, and realistically what it is it's just saying that obviously the current manifest repo isn't in a very good state, but we need obviously the working group to be established for them to take ownership of it, to really start trying to solve it. I think that's what we kind of came to in that issue tracker.
Yeah, I think we'll probably start with a couple of refactoring issues and then assign people to start working on individual issues. Like, for example, the notebook working group might take a look at the Jupyter set of manifests, and like, each working group and probably look at their related manifests and start from there, I guess.
Yeah, I think part of the main issue with that repo, I mean, it's not to have this discussion now, but I think part of the main issue with that repo is actually its structure is very, very messy. Like it's hard to know what's even connected to what. So maybe that would be like, and that's kind of what that main issue was targeting. And it's.
Oh yeah, I think we can probably restructure it around the working groups and then kind of have a per working group owners files. So if the notebook working group takes ownership of the manifest, then the Jupyter web app, the notebook controller manifests, and all related manifests would go inside that. So we already have a established working group structure. So probably mirroring that inside the manifest repo would
and I assume all of those auxiliary projects will be owned by the deployments?
Not the plan was to kind of create a extra control plane working group and then possibly merge both the deployment and the control plane working groups in the future to manage the auxiliary projects.
Okay. Is anyone wanting to comment on that, or just because that's...
Firstly, we want to kind of ensure that the manifest repo is okay and in a deployable state, and then kind of take on additional responsibility of managing the auxiliary projects and so on.
So I think what we've converged on in the PR for the deployments is, one of the responsibilities of this working group is going to be providing a centralized catalog of the application manifests. So not necessarily maintaining or curating the application manifests themselves, that would be the application owners or the respective work group owners, but just gathering them together and then providing them into a centralized repo so that it was easy for users to sort of download and deploy them. and then likewise providing tooling like KF to deploy applications from the catalog. So I think that's sounds pretty neat, clean to me, and creates a clear separation of the responsibilities between the other working groups and the deployments working group. I think where that leaves an unclear gray area, which is what we're trying to figure out, is we have a bunch of other manifests that are related towards creating these generic vanilla distributions of Kubeflow and doing things like installing Istio and Dex and a bunch of other stuff. And I think the lack of clarity is how do we structure that as a project, or should we first can we structure it as a project that makes sense to be owned by the deployments working group, or should we treat it as like we do all the other platform distributions and not make it the responsibility or ownership of a working group, because it'll be owned by a platform or vendor like we do with the IBM and AWS and GCP configurations. So I think that to me is the crux of the issue that we're trying to resolve.
And Amish?
Yeah, I mean, my experience has been, in general, Dex has given us more pain, or given Kubeflow community more pain than the gain, right? And it's possible, we like sort of rally behind a minimal Kubeflow distribution, right? Which is, and then, beyond that, if you need to configure production grade authentication authorization, then, these are available as templates, right? If somebody owns it, but if you probably go to IBM Cloud or AWS, you might get a totally different way of configuring authentication and authorization, which to me would be more acceptable solution, right? Because a lot of the places where and the other point in that would be, sort of separating the production model serving stack from the core distribution, right? So I would say the another problem which has been is the KF serving with its dependency on Knative and Istio. And more importantly, right, when you are deploying something like this, almost any user, if he is trying to set up a model serving platform, he would not set it up in the same place where his dev environment is, right? So there is a build side of Kubeflow, which is the notebooks, the pipelines, the distributed training operators, the HPO, and that should be one distribution. Model serving, you can get either directly from Selden or get KF serving, right? Because, they have their own dependencies. Plus, if you need authentication authorization, that's a separate stack. And we rally behind the core stack, right? And that's probably a way to solve this problem. Otherwise, it has become too bloated, and sort of, intermingling of this build and prod side into the same stack is causing the problems.
So I think that is an issue, but I don't think is that really the same issue we're talking about here? Like, I think there's kind of like the more general issue of does the Kubeflow project own a stack? Because right now it doesn't seem like we do. Like a deployable version of Kubeflow is not really owned by anyone right now, other than the vendors. And I think that's the main question that people are asking is, should there be a generic distribution that is
Yes,
just...
and that what I'm suggesting is, minus Dex, minus serving solution, right? so like a build generic Kubeflow distribution, which is focused on build. If you need, the model serving part, right, then, you can get these additional manifests, because most practical scenarios, people are not going to set up their production model serving on the same cluster where they have the build side, right? So it's best to sort of provide it as an add-on.
Well, Kubeflow has one dependency on Istio. And that's a good thing because it isolates a lot of other dependencies. For example, it references Istio, which I think is a great thing. So then we can leave it up to the platform or to the end user to set up Istio plus Dex plus Cert Manager plus DNS plus other capabilities of the platform that are platform capabilities that should be, I think, outside of Kubeflow. As long as Kubeflow assumes that there is Istio there, then a lot of dependencies are removed. And then we can provide like a very opinionated installation of Istio and Dex which is somewhat of a separate project. And there will be a lot of variability there, how people want to deploy Istio, DAX, and other things. What do you think about that one?
That is pretty much the proposal in the issue. In the issue that I raised. But again, these sort of decisions, I guess, we have to find an owner for that deployment type, that generic type. And I guess that's the question, right? That's the current question: is that going to be the deployment working group? Because I feel like part of, like, at least from my perspective, personal opinion here, the deployment working group should be somewhat concerned about making sure that it's at least possible to deploy a version of Kubeflow. And I don't think they should be thinking about that from a vendor perspective, because that's not their responsibility, but they should be thinking about that from at least some minimal distribution. And I think that's where the generic distribution tool, if you want to call it that, comes in. Even if it's not a very commonly deployed thing, I think it probably would be commonly deployed, but like, even if it's not, it at least acts as an end-to-end test of it's actually possible to deploy Kubeflow, and it gives you what you expect.
Yeah. Well, at Agile Stacks, we actually have this we call adapter stack to Kubeflow, and the EKS version of it is open source already because it's ready. On-prem version is going to be open source once it's in this opinionated stack of components that can deploy on vanilla Kubernetes cluster. And basically they include Istio and DEX and Cert Manager and DNS and a few other things, Harbor. And those are all like optional, and you can like take them out if you don't want to install Harbor, you know.
Jerry,
so we can contribute that to Kubeflow deployment working group and maintain it as part of Kubeflow repository. We currently maintain it as part of
I think you're dropping out, Igor.
Oh, sorry about that. So we can contribute that from Agile Stacks repository to Kubeflow repository, and we can maintain that stack as part of the deployment group.
Again, that's not a decision to be made now, and I don't know. I think I'm just personally, I think the current deployment method should be improved before we start trying to completely use a different approach.
I think to me that what's missing is, I think we're missing a set of principles that sort of guide, you know, decisions like whether Istio or Knative should be included, right? So I think what I'd like to see is, you know, we define a project, we define a scope and principles around that project such that, you know, when we're trying to answer the question, should Istio or Knative or DEX be included, we can reference that scope and principles, and we can articulate yes or no, and sort of everybody would come to sort of the same conclusion with respect to those principles. Otherwise, it's just sort of, you know, an ad hoc process, and then it's, I don't know, it just feels like creep and conflict. So I think that's what we're struggling to find and figure out.
Yeah, I guess this kind of bubbles back to having like what forms a conformant Kubeflow cluster, or like what components or what minimal versions of Istio or Knative or, you know, whatever components that go into an Kubeflow cluster, and kind of like answering that question would probably help, I guess.
I mean, I don't necessarily know that this is really about conformance, right? Like, I think this depends on, like, if our objective is to give people a day zero experience that's really good to get started with Kubeflow, then there's a good chance you probably need to install some extra things, right? So, you know, if we were to install on Minikube or Kind, for example, right, and we want people to try out Kubeflow, well, then we probably have to install Istio and Knative, right? Because those are, otherwise they wouldn't be included, and they would have to go through some other process, right? So if our goal is to create that day zero experience, then we come up with a different example, different.
That's right, and call it more like an adapter stack or something. It's anything like Kind cluster, or maybe KubeADM. Somebody just uses KubeADM to spin up a cluster on GKE, and they want to deploy Kubeflow next thing. So they cannot, because there are many dependencies. So we create an adapter stack that deploys required components, Istio and Dex and others.
And I think, to Animesh's point, right? If you're trying to produce, if you're focused more on day 2 and, providing people with production deployments, then you probably want to do things like separate out your dev and your train and your serve clusters, right? And you would come up with a very different configuration. So I think we're missing those principles and scope that can guide those decisions.
I also think that there's, again, that this comes back around to the main point we kept talking about here is what is owned by Kubeflow itself and what is owned by the vendors. Like fundamentally, I think Kubeflow should be deployable without any requirement for a vendor, but the vendors are encouraged even to make real production day 2 ready things like you're talking about.
So I
like
think
what I'm trying to say, pretty much what we've already proposed, right?
So I think we can't sort of adopt a project, right? So in order for Kubeflow to own something, a work group has to own and sponsor that project. And in order for like a work group to sponsor and adopt a project, we have to sort of understand what the scope and objective of that project is. And so I think that's what we're lacking. So we all sort of agree that there should be some sort of deployment story that's maintained by the Kubeflow working group, but we're struggling to figure out how to properly scope that project. That's I think the crux of the issue right now.
Okay, well, is it sufficient for us to just say that they will provide, like, be very general about what we're saying they provide, like a deployable version of Kubeflow that is vendor independent, and then just let them figure out what they want to actually support?
I think what is missing exactly is a common services work group, right? I mean, things like Istio, Dex, profile controller, common UI dashboard. This all is, set of common services around the individual working groups, right? And there is not a defined ownership there, right? So that, as long as there is a work group which is focused on these common services, right? You need ingress, you need load balancing, you need authentication, authorization, you need a UI dashboard. This is like, and if we don't have that, then the deployment working group is sort of in that position where there is no owner delivering these pre-integrated common services or tested common services.
Well, they don't deliver them. That's delivered by the platform that the user installs on, right? That's not a part of Kubeflow. We don't own Istio.
Yeah, so is it like going to be specific to Kubernetes, or is it ML infra specific, or like does it add value to Kubeflow and by adding all those things, or are we like diverging down a different path and solving different problems by actually including them?
When you say that we don't own Istio, we own Istio's integration in Kubeflow. We own Dex integration in Kubeflow. We own the common UI dashboard. We own the profile controller, right? So I'm not sure why you're saying we don't own.
What I'm trying to say is, in the same way that we don't own Kubernetes, like we don't have a working group which is dedicated to determining Kubernetes itself, because that doesn't make sense. Istio,
yeah, but you understand the difference between common services and underlying. Running something on Kubernetes is for everyone here. Doing ingress load balancing with Istio or doing authentication authorization testing with Istio is not for everyone, right? So this is where the ownership falls, right? I mean, currently, if I'm delivering
all deployments require Istio currently, as far as I can see, don't they?
I mean, depending, right? I mean, it is because that's how we have created that dependency chain, right?
But I mean, anyway, so I'm sorry, other people want to talk. Igor, what are you saying, or other people?
Well, I am on the same page with the common services group or platform services group. It's not a trivial task for an end user to go from vanilla Kubernetes to Kubernetes that is ready for Kubeflow deployment. A lot of users who are advanced users, yeah, they will have Istio and they will have Knative deployed. But for first-hand users, inexperienced ones, we need to provide some kind of common services, opinionated stack that they can deploy to basically bring some required capabilities to Kubernetes cluster that Kubeflow expects, because vanilla Kubernetes doesn't have it, right? Vanilla Kubernetes is not a ready-to-use platform in many ways, right? It lacks a lot of capabilities that applications require.
Anyway, I think this is a discussion for the deployment working group, or at least once we've established their charter. But like, I think that Dex and Istio are deployment specific. Like, they are not actually part of Kubeflow. And Kubeflow should have an opinionated dependency on what versions of those things we support. Maybe not Dex, but like Istio and Knative. But I think that should be left up to the owners of the deployments themselves, not because it's not part of Kubeflow, right? We just say
they are not exactly. I think that we're all on the same page in a sense that they do not belong to Kubeflow, but we want to solve the problem for users who need help with deploying these components that are required by Kubeflow.
That sounds like a job for the deployment working group, doesn't it?
Could be. That's probably where it's is falling right now.
I don't agree, right? I don't agree. No? And, you know, as I said, I mean, deployment working group would not be owning, you know, ensuring integration with Dex or Istio or, you know, the Kubeflow profile controller for authentication authorization. These are common services. Deployment working group would deploy Kubeflow, manage Kubeflow, right? But the components which are needed to deploy Kubeflow, whether it's Istio, what version of Istio is needed, whether it's Dex, what version of Dex is needed, whether a profile controller is needed, that should be a common services work group.
Okay, yeah, I like that too. We just don't have it yet, right?
But yeah, like, I don't see the Jeremy. Sorry, I'll let you talk. Sorry.
So I think if we look at this from the perspective of the working groups and the proposals, I think the thing again that we're looking for when we approve proposals for working groups right now is very clear scope, because of the and well-defined scope, because the fundamental problem that we're really trying to address right now with the formation of working groups is accountability. And so I think with coming back to this, the working groups deployments proposal, there's two ways we can go. So one is we can continue to try to figure out how to properly scope a project that's managing this other definition of a deployments aspect, and sort of block the working group deployments formation, or we can sort of just go with a more narrow charter for now for the work group deployments, and then and sort of leave that deployment story basically outside the scope of that working group for now, until we can figure out how to properly scope it and include that into the charter. That I would say that's a decision for the proposed leads of the deployments working group to decide.
You mean leave out the generic, like the deployment configs, and then figure out how to include them or where to include them later on?
Right. So I think for now you could basically say that we're not going to own that as the working group. If people want to, vendors want to come in and take up that mantle. So if Aricto wants to provide mini KF, if Agile Stacks wants to provide all their own sort of opinionated distribution, that would be the way we could address that until we can figure out some way to fit it into the work group's deployments charter.
Got it. Okay. Yeah.
Well, I agree with what you're saying. I think we do, as a community, need to seriously consider that we do need a generic stack. That's kind of the other thing. Like, regardless of where it ends up being owned, I think we can't just leave it to the vendors to own Kubeflow. Otherwise, that means the project doesn't own its own project.
I'm not sure I agree with that, but we can discuss more some other time.
Cool. I guess that's for the community to decide, but yeah. Okay, so then if anyone else got anything they want to raise there before we move on?
Can we just quickly, speak about the special interest group for feature source, which I think we just skipped over.
Oh yeah, that was pretty much what we're going to next, yeah.
Oh, okay, you're highlighting that second item, so. So I just want to use like 2 or 3 minutes. We created a special interest group so this is Willem, for feature stores. The reason it's not a working group is because right now there's no specific deployment or project owned by the feature store group. even though Feast is now a component that's a part of the Kubeflow documentation. So this interest group is going to drive getting feature stores better integrated into Kubeflow and making it easier for users to get started. And ideally, we'd make that very easy to use with the existing components. So to those of you that don't know what a feature store is, it's basically a data management system that allows you to kind of source and define features for models and then expose that to models for training and serving. So with Feast, we previously demoed this. We didn't integrate that like very quickly, and so we're kind of restarting the conversation now. And the special interest group will drive this process, not just from like the documentation standpoint that it is right now, but towards like actual deployments as actual code that gets that users can use alongside the existing stack. So there's still open questions there, but I just wanted to intro this special interest group. I think short term, we'll probably start setting up our regular cadences, and we'll probably reach out to the other working groups to figure out what their requirements are and how we can kind of deduplicate scope. And I have open questions on what exactly the process is that we should follow if we want to get, let's say, Feast better integrated into Kubeflow, and whether that process is now clear, because it seems like right now things are very up in the air in terms of deployments. Does anybody have any comments on this SIG?
I think just in the context of deployment, what I would suggest, and as you're saying with the problem, right? The problem of Kubeflow has been the breadth, right? And packaging or trying to package everything together has, been a bit problematic, right? So I would probably suggest that as long as, you follow or give the same deployment architecture, right? Which is kfctl, kfdev, customized v3, right, which can deploy Feast. That's pretty much what we should require of any working groups, right? I mean, I was just looking like, if you go to Tekton, you can either deploy Tekton CD independently, you can deploy Tekton triggers independently, right? Or even in case of Knative, Knative serving is different than Knative eventing. Like, we are probably the only community which is trying to bundle everything together, and not only bundle everything together, but also, provide common services around everything bundled together. And maybe, that's causing a bit of the churn, right? So from that perspective, I would like your point that, definitely taking feedback from all the other working groups so as to make sure, there is no duplication of work, as well as there are integration touch points. That definitely remains valid. But in terms of bundling it together with the Kubeflow deployment, it's like, yes, there is the deployment has the same architecture. You have created, a kfctl, kfdev customized v3 based stack which can deploy Feast, and that's good, and that's in the documentation. So if somebody needs Feast, they use the same tools and they can get Feast independently. Right.
One more thing would probably be a notebook story and how you can integrate with development in our build, train, deploy story. That would be something to look into as well.
Sure, that sounds good.
Who owns the docs right now for that sort of stuff? Does any of the working groups own one of the docs, or the proposed working groups for the whole sort of, well, just generally even, because that would be, I think a lot of what you're describing, Willem, is related to documentation at this point, but unless Feast becomes actually part of Kubeflow?
Well, so we want to go from documentation to actually providing those installations using customizing KFCTL or whatever we need to provide. So if somebody's
probably updating the Kubeflow documentation with the reference to this, and potentially participating in the end-to-end example development, right? So there's a Kubeflow example, end-to-end example that includes Feast as a feature store. That would be good too, yes. Right? And it spans multiple working groups, which is probably okay, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So we'll definitely have to work with other working groups in order to make sure that this is a cohesive story for people and not just some weird component on the side. Because it really will become a part of these end-to-end tutorials. Yeah.
Bringing back to that question though, who actually owns the docs right now? Does anyone own the docs? And should the deployment working group own the deployment docs at least? As a question related?
work groups should own their respective aspect of the docs. And then there's been a couple of folks that are curating the docs more holistically. Joe from Google, and then I think his name is Olshouse. I only know his GitHub ID is like 8-bitmap something, but he's been doing a lot of work driving the docs lately.
Cool. Just making sure, because I think that's another pain point for deployment, or just generally using Kubeflow, is the docs are kind of in a bit of a state. But yeah. Cool. If you've got nothing else anyone wants to say about the feature store interest group, anyone got anything? Animesh or anyone who's waiting?
I mean, the only thing is, Willem, it would be worth, I know Alice has worked with you in the past, right? Looking at the integration of KF serving, right? So the example you mentioned end-to-end where, if we have the same data set features, which we are using for training, then, moving to the serving side and then, leveraging them for KF serving to enable some of the more advanced use cases around drift, anomaly, etc. That probably will be a good thing, right? So I know the time doesn't work for you given that the time zone you are in. The KF serving meetings are typically, bi-weekly on Wednesdays at 10 a.m. PST. So if you do have, some counterpart in US, right, you can attend that, right? This will be a good topic to bring up there.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, we should reignite that one.
Well, maybe like the working groups should alternate their time zones for their meetings. Like, it seems like obviously that may not make sense if there's only working group members from one time zone, but like,
so for 0.8, we're going to be adding support for AWS and for other cloud providers. And so there's a heavy focus on that for now, but I think directly after that, we're going to have a lot of bandwidth to pick up these kind of nice integrations with KF serving and the training stack and AutoML and tutorials and all these things. So I think we can do that. We don't need to change those time zones yet for the meetings. We have people in other time zones as well.
Cool. So we're pretty much at the end of the meeting, but I just want to really highlight that all the component owners pretty much need to go and update the manifests, and well, it depends on what we want to do really, but I don't know whether we need to cut a minor release for Kubeflow 1.1.1 or something, because a lot of the manifests have incorrect, almost every component has incorrect image versions tagged in them for Kubeflow 1.1. So most of them are still using the same ones they were using for 1.0. So that I'll post that issue here, but 1.1 issues. Images. But like, so I've listed them out, all the ones that are there, but pretty much every component needs to fix something. So every major component. So I don't really know what the best way to fix that is, or if we just kind of abandon Kubeflow 1.1 and then go for a Kubeflow 1.2 sort of fix for this. But yeah.
So, I mean, my view is that, the applications missed the release cut. And so I think it's fine. They missed the release cut. Kubeflow 1.1 includes older versions of the applications. I would probably encourage application owners to prioritize making sure they're on track to release in 1.2. And then if they are on track and have resolved fix that for 1.2, then they can think about investing in backporting and fixing for 1.1.
So when are we who's the release person for 1.2, and when is that cutoff for that so people can be aware?
I'm the releaser for 1.2. We're going to start cutting freezing code from October 15th and then cut a release by November 15th.
So October 15th, to be precise, for everyone who didn't hear that.
Yeah, for the code freeze, yeah.
Yeah, so by that point, should everyone have already updated their manifests, or?
Yeah, so after that, we'll probably we'll start release cuts with October, and then we'll probably have to do cherry picks after that.
So to kind of ask, so we're expecting that the current KF def sort of structure stays the same for 1.2, and maybe in 1.3 is when the deployment working group makes some changes? Is that what we're kind of saying?
We can probably, like if Jupyter notebooks, I think you've made some good, like a lot of changes there. Maybe we can start with maybe 1 or 2 applications and then change it to a different structure and try to clean those up, and then follow it up with other components in the 1.3 release. Yeah.
So yeah, the issue with just about the Jupyter notebooks, the only issue there is that there is a pending refactor. So though that pull request that I've made may not actually, we weren't planning on putting that into 1.2.
Okay.
We were planning on if we get time. October is obviously not that far away now. But if we get time, moving across to the new centralized backend for the notebooks and TensorBoard applications, and then just implementing the changes that I made into the original one and dropping the old Jupyter Web app entirely.
Okay. No, okay. If not, we'll probably have to just move it to 1.3.
Yeah, because I mean, there's some debate in the notebook sort of people about whether we should release that pull request as 1.2 or just wait.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
But yeah, I think that's the problem is the time zones are a bit problematic. So I think the other main people are asleep right now. Okay, cool. So I guess that's just kind of important. So I just want to highlight that issue to people, or yeah, there's a patch for the issue there, and I wrote patches that moved them to ones that were tagged as 1.1. If the component owners tagged them as 1.1, I put it there in the patch. But who knows what we should do there. Other than that, we're pretty much over time. Is there anything anyone really needs to raise with the community before we close? Cool. I guess this is goodbye.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Matt.
You guys.